Welcome, everybody, to the Mind Body Podcast. I am Henrik Børsting Jacobsen, Associate Professor of Health Psychology here at the University of Oslo. And today I have the pleasure of discussing HRV and the immense popularity of wearables and this wave of personalized medicine that has hit us in the recent years here in Norway and all over the world. And I want to delve deeper into the metrics and the why and the how these wearables work. And to do that, I have brought with me three distinguished guests. First, with me live on Zoom is Marco Altini, who is a PhD in data science and the founder of HRV for Training. Marco is widely renowned as an expert in HRV and the use of that for specifically training. And I also have the honor of having Dan Quintana, who's an associate professor of health psychology alongside me here at the University of Oslo, and Fredrik Mentzoni, who's I'm not going to even try to do that title of Olympiatoppen in English, but he is the main person behind what kind of technical gear they use and how they use it in our best athletes here in Norway. And Fredrik, please correct me if I said something wrong about that, or even the title. But let's start at the beginning, because at the basis of all these different approaches to how we can use these wearables to learn more about our health and well-being, there is this golden, I should say, chalice of measurement called HRV, heart rate variability. And I would like to throw this question to you, Marco, please, in the beginning. What is HRV, and how did this metric become so fundamental for understanding what these wearables can and cannot do?
Well, thank you first for having me today. So in the context of wearables, I would say HRV has an important role first because it's one of the very few things that wearables can measure. So sometimes maybe we also need to simply recognize that we use it in all possible manners because that's what we have. There are other things that, it would be nice to measure from the body, how hormone level changes, all sort of things related to, health and performance and things like that. But HRV is something we can measure easily and relatively accurately also with wearables. And we do that by basically looking at the variation between consecutive heartbeats over a certain time frame, which could be a few minutes, it could be a full night, or it could be, even during the day as they try to do today. And this variation in heartbeats, normally you would measure it with an electrocardiogram, so measuring the actual electrical activity at the heart. Now, that is not the most convenient thing, so we started looking at other ways to capture the same information or something that is very tightly coupled to that. And that is, for example, via optical methods like wearing a wristband or a ring or a watch, we can measure basically changes in blood flow at the periphery, which are, of course, tightly coupled to changes in heart activity as blood flows when the heart beats. So we capture the data this way. We look at these changes in consecutive heartbeats over a certain time period, for example, again, with a wristband or any other device that can capture these optical signals. And we compute metrics that represent this variability in consecutive heartbeats. And we do that because this variability is associated to our stress response. So as we face a stressor, we cannot measure, stress, this somewhat abstract entity, but the body responds typically in a rather systematic way in which the autonomic nervous system is triggered. And for example, sympathetic activity is higher and parasympathetic activity is more suppressed. So the, let's say, part of the body's response that is typically taking care of rest and recovery is somewhat suppressed when we face a stressor. And again, it would be nice to measure this thing, parasympathetic activity, but we cannot really do that non-invasively. So the reason why we look at heart rate variability is that parasympathetic activity directly modulates heart rhythm. So our heart rhythm changes in response to stressors after parasympathetic activity has influenced heart rhythm, and we capture that indirect influence. So heart rate variability becomes an indirect proxy of our stress response. If we measure it, under certain conditions at the right time, we are careful, with artifacts and all sorts of things that we can discuss later. But the reason why it starts there is that it's something that is measurable and it's linked to our stress response. So I think that is a bit the basis that we try to exploit when we then use this data in the context of, higher level inferences and applications that are common today.
Thank you, Marco. That's I think that's an excellent starting point for our discussion. And Dan or Fredrik, would you have anything to add or any twists you want to put on Marco's brief explanation of HRV?
Yeah, I think Marco made a really good point that when you're measuring it, these measurements have to be done under quite exact conditions. The basis of heart rate variability, or what HRV actually means, was originally done in the 70s and 80s, and they looked at pharmacological blockade. And by blockading the parasympathetic nervous system activity, they were able to see changes in HRV. When we're measuring it today, we need to do this within very strict conditions. So in the work that we do within the lab, when we're measuring it, we go to a lot of trouble in actually making sure these conditions are quite similar from participant to participant. And if there are any differences there, this can make quite a big difference. So I think one example that we've investigated in the past couple of years is looking at the simple impact of water intake. You might think that water is relatively benign, and quite often we'll be sipping along, drinking a lot of water. And me and my colleague, James Heathers, back during our PhD, we thought, well, what is the actual impact of water intake on heart rate variability? And we actually found that the more water you drink, the larger impact that it has within a dose-dependent level. And it got to the point where sometimes a research participant would come in holding a big bottle of water, and we're like, how much water did you drink? Come back tomorrow. You've drunk too much water. So there are so many conditions like that which can influence heart rate variability. And I think that's one of the reasons why quite often when it comes to measuring this from day to day, it's recommended that we measure it at the start of the day upon waking, because you're less likely to have these sorts of effects on heart rate variability. Exactly. So there's so many factors that can affect this particular measure.
Yeah, and I think it's a valid point you have there with the need for a stringent measurement. And I think that just bringing it down because I feel like every time I talk about HRV, my dad his eyes glosses over, and he's like, there's this magical heart measure that measures all these kinds of technicalities. But I think the main takeaways from you guys' input here is that we're actually measuring a proxy of what we want to measure, because we are not able to measure directly this parasympathetic regulation of the heart. So the first thing is that we're actually a little bit away from what we're trying to measure when we're trying to measure stress and the way stress responses act in the body. And the second thing that when we're measuring this proxy, we have to be incredibly careful with how we measure it. And that brings me to you, Fredrik, because your athletes, they are both extremely knowledgeable in this, but also use it a lot for their recovery and restitution, I guess, when they're training. Or would you disagree with me?
Yeah, maybe some of them do, but I think most probably use their watch for training, and then they see these metrics, the HRV, which you can measure in the morning, or if you use a watch like a Garmin or a Polar or something, you will often get this reading from your HRV during the night. So the athletes see this and they start wondering, what should I do about this? Do I need to adjust my training because of this number? So I think that's the most common way for elite athletes to be exposed to HRV.
And that is basically wondering, what is this number and what does it mean for me as an athlete? Should I consider it in my training schedule and my restitution schedule?
Yes, and I think that for us, we are a bit cautious about this. And I think there are two main reasons for that. The one is the technology itself. As Marco said, we can measure it with ECG, but these devices use PPG sensors. So we have something that is not perfect, but it's probably good enough if you are at rest or during the night. So that's the technology itself. But then the most important reason is that we know that this number can maybe do more harm than good. Say, for instance, you have an important competition and you wake up and your watch is telling you, first of all, your HRV is not as good as it should be. It's probably lower than what you are used to. Maybe even you get information that your sleep was not good enough, your body battery is not charged enough, and so on. So this will reduce your confidence going into this competition. And that's the last thing you want to know, right? So it's probably better to be blinded for all of this. Maybe you had a bad night of sleep, but you can still perform. We know that.
Yeah.
This is often the case.
Especially when you have kids like us.
Yeah, but I mean, for top athletes as well, they are probably often traveling a lot. Maybe they ate something that was not optimal.
Yeah.
Maybe they didn't sleep as well as they do when they are home. Maybe the temperature, the weather, and so on is a little different than what they are used to. So there are many factors that can affect them. But you don't need to get, I would say, a negative confidence boost on top of that.
Yeah, exactly. And that you bring up a lot of things, Fredrik, because there's this metric, right? This basis which is a proxy of something, meaning that it's measuring something that is related to, not the actual response, and it is measuring it in a suboptimal way, in a way, if you're not doing it in a very precise manner, in a specific setting.
I think we can say that if you are measuring, well, we can refer to what Marco has done. His studies. If you are measuring this, your HRV during the night or in the morning, it's probably good enough for the use. But that's the HRV, and then you have all the other matrices,
which are derived from it.
Yeah, that's more problematic, I guess.
So let's go into more detail about this. So you have this HRV, which is the basis for a lot of information that comes from your wearable. Either you wear a Whoop, or you wear a Polar Watch, or you wear a Garmin. You have a lot of different options in wearables, but many of them have these composite scores, or these recovery scores, and these stress scores, and these sleep scores. And one of the things that I know that people use the most is that they want to use their wearable to get better and deeper sleep. That's something that my patients often express. So what are your thoughts on using your wearable for that precise? And I'll give that to you first, Marco.
All right. So let's put it this way. First, when we build these additional scores based on the data we collect, we are always, I think there is an aspect there, maybe it's I don't know, somewhat under discussed. I don't know if that's the right word, but it's the whole point or idea that companies try to push is that there is some personalization, or it is measuring from you, and is the data you get, and these custom scores you get are really for you, right? It's very unique to you, and that is why it is useful. But when we start looking at these made-up scores, like it's sleep scores and readiness or recovery and these sort of things, they are actually coming from a generic model that uses very simple principles across how stressors impact the general population. And a simple example is, okay, HRV is your physiological response, but then if we put it together with your sleep time and your activity time in a recovery score, then you have sort of a deterministic output. That means that every time you sleep less, your recovery is lower. So it doesn't really mean that you have not recovered as much, or that your physiology is impaired in any way. Like, it could be that you sleep a bit less and you're totally fine, or that you're more active yesterday and you're totally fine. but the score will penalize you based on a generic model that thinks that, these factors mean that the recovery is different. So I think this is an important aspect to understand, especially when we work with athletes, right? I think in that context specifically, we are really interested in the physiology. So if we go to a training camp and we do more, we don't want to have a recovery score that is lower just because we are doing more. We know we are doing more, right? That is the whole point of the training camp. But if we look at the physiology, maybe we learn something. Is the physiology still normal? Heart rate is not particularly elevated or particularly suppressed, and same thing for HRV. Then maybe we learn that, okay, we are coping well with the stimulus and everything is going as expected. But these combined scores, I think they try to give us the impression that they capture this holistic picture, but eventually I think they sort of dilute the insight sometimes by using this generic model in which, you have certain outcomes that are directly linked to your behavior more than your physiology. And in fact, if you use a wearable, you can just go in the app, you can adjust your sleep time, manually, and then you're less recovered or more recovered if you put more sleep time. So it's just, not entirely using, signals captured from your body. So I think that is one of the issues that often come up. And I get it why they create these things, right? You still even if you mean well, right, you're trying to create something that people can use to make adjustments, but I think the underlying assumption that this data can basically guide you is somewhat flawed. So I think these devices are more helpful if we have a plan to start with, and then we want to make small adjustments, then it can be helpful.
Yeah,
but,
and it's like
if we try to make it, sorry, go ahead.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to say that it's kind of also relatable. Even though if you're not an athlete, I can have my daughter. She comes to my bed almost every night, and it depends on when she comes. But in the weekends we can sleep longer. But I would say that I have much better sleep quality when she's not kicking me in the bed than when she is kicking me in the bed. And that brings me to the point that the quality of your sleep is a sort of a fuzzy individualistic perspective or perception, not directly derived from the period of time you spend in bed. So that just speaks to your point that it's not only for athletes, it's also for common people or common everyday problems like having poor sleep quality that is challenged by using this type of metric in a way that you describe, Marco. So I was just eager because I agree with your points.
Yeah, I think we make some big oversimplifications there. And, coming back to your question, can we use, wearables to get better sleep? So wearables can capture some aspects of our behavior, right? So, we criticize them a fair amount, but at the same time, you have some objective metrics that try to track your behavior in terms of sleep. And we can also learn from that. Sometimes it's really just the basics, are we going to bed, at a decent time? Are we spending enough time in bed? Are we being consistent with our, bedtime and wake up time? All sorts of things that in theory help us sleeping better. So these kind of things can also be helpful for some people. Looking at the data can give you some insights, can help you make some small adjustments in your behavior. And then from that, maybe you can sleep better, right? So I think there is an aspect also of feedback that can be informative and helpful, even though I think we also need to be careful always which metrics we look at, right? There's a lot provided to us, some. So we talked about HRV is a proxy, but I always say at least it's a measurement of something. Like when we go to these other things in terms of sleep stages or even just sleep time, then we are really not measuring anything, right? Everything is an estimate. So sleep time typically is based on movement, maybe drops in temperature or changes in heart rate. So some physiology is just, for sleep onset, but typically then it's based on movement. So sure, when we sleep, we move less than when we are awake, but there's margin of error, right? So these devices can also have quite large errors in terms of detecting bedtime. If I'm reading my Kindle in bed, I'm not moving at all. And typically I get a bedtime that is, off quite a bit from the time I'm actually then trying to start to sleep. So, and sleep time is one of the better ones, right? Because if we go to stages, then stages, there is even more inaccuracies because it's yet another layer of estimation, right? What we try to capture there is brain states, but then we are not really measuring anything related to our brain activity, to our, muscle activity, eye movement, those sort of things that are actually a reference for sleep stages, right? We are actually estimating those from, again, the one thing we can measure, which is heart rate variability, and, what derives from that, even just heart rate and then movement, because maybe we have an accelerometer-oriented device, or these days temperature sensors are quite common, and that can be a bit helpful. But still, there is larger errors in there. There's a more challenging application, even if devices are getting better and the accuracy is getting better. I always, I'm always a bit careful here because I think the validations are also not matching exactly the use of the technology. What I mean is that typically a validation is done on a large population, and we look at the accuracy, and across the population it works, 85% well at detecting the use of that sleep stage. But there is almost no more research at all looking at, can we capture a relative change in the sleep stages over time for the same person? Because that's eventually what people do, right? They do an intervention and then they look at, has my deep sleep changed? Like, I don't think we have any evidence that we can capture these changes meaningfully in relation to an intervention with a wearable so that we can derive these conclusions. So, I would always be very careful when we try to do that. And in fact, like, I will just add one more thing. One way that I like to look at these things, typically to understand if it is a metric I should bother with or not, is to just use a bunch of wearables. And then you look at the metric, the output, over time for like a couple of weeks. If I look at my resting heart rate collected in the night, typically it's almost an exact match. If I look at HRV, very close. If I look at sleep time, there's some gaps here and there, again, depending on bedtime detection and so on, but relative changes are still quite accurate. If I look at sleep stages, depending on which wearable I use, my deep sleep might have increased or reduced and things like that, right? So this inconsistency tells me that maybe we are just not there in terms of capturing those, small changes in sleep stages over time in response to behavior and other stresses. So I think we need to be careful. Always, people like to pick a wearable and, that is my favorite, that is the best, and these kind of things. But typically, they are very similar, especially the main brands. And even when they're good at something, it doesn't mean that they are good at everything. Even some devices are very good even at measuring heart rate during exercise. That is not so easy. But then it doesn't mean that they're good at sleep stages or SpO2. Like, we always need to evaluate the exact metric we are interested in. I think that is also quite important.
I think also, just to add to that the individual variation in how well, for instance, a watch is actually fitting your wrist is quite large. So a watch that fits snugly on my wrist and may be able to measure HRV quite well is maybe not the best fit for you or for someone else. So that's also a problem. So I can take the top model, the best one, the most expensive model, and it can actually be quite poor because the fit is not good.
Yeah, exactly. So you have to actually feel the snugness.
Sometimes you can't even feel that. You have to measure it and compare it with some good reference.
And this will, of course, affect the sleep metrics as well, because if there's movement in the watch, so it will give you poorer outcome anyways, because everything is based on this.
Yeah, you have, when you're moving, you have the motion artifacts problem as well. If you're outdoors, the temperature on the skin can reduce the quality. But if the fit is not good, then you have a problem anyway.
I think a larger issue here as well is the complete lack of specificity. So the measures that we have for HRV, the proxies that we use are fairly accurate. The studies that have compared PPG with ECG, pretty good. I'd be pretty satisfied with these sorts of things. So we know that when measuring these things, if we see reduced heart rate variability, which we used as a proxy of reduced parasympathetic nervous system activity, that's pretty accurate. But the question is, what does that actually mean?
Yeah.
What is actually contributing to these things? And that's really hard to determine. All we can say is, yes, parasympathetic activity is reduced, but there could be a number of things that could be causing that particular thing. And that's really hard to actually determine.
And we kind of we revert back to this metrics. That's why I started with this metric, and it's so important to understand the pitfalls and the uncertainties of this metric. And that's not because I myself I'm a huge fan of HRV. I've used it a lot in my studies. I even had a 4-year-long clinical trial, randomized clinical trial, where HRV was my primary outcome. Marco's version of the PPG measure in the camera HRV app, with the specific idea of this giving me something of value. But what we see there is that the patient's experience of pain and stress is not related to the actual HRV measure. And that was baffling for me at the time. But now, me and Fredrik have been sending papers back and forth and discussing this a little bit. And we see that in other studies as well, that actually this measure of HRV does not map well with the individual's experience of stress. What do you guys think about that? Is that, I see you nodding, so you're not surprised. But would you expect this from the get-go? Sort of.
And just to clarify, now, because I agree with what you said, Dan, as well, but now you are talking controlled measurement of HRV.
Yeah.
Right?
Not into the wild.
During rest, right?
Yeah.
So you are not outdoors, you are not walking, you are not watching TV even.
Yeah. No, it was in my study. It was lying down.
Okay, so the measurement is good enough. Let's assume that.
Yeah.
But it doesn't correspond with what the patient is telling you.
It doesn't even correlate with what the person is experiencing when it comes to stress. What do you guys think about that?
It's not, it's discouraging, but it's not surprising at the same time, because there are so many factors which can contribute. Even if you are controlling conditions as much as possible, lying down in the lab, don't drink too much the night before, the sorts of things that we always say within our studies. There's a lot of differences there that can potentially contribute to this. And although we're interested in one particular variable, say it's pain, there are other variables which could be contributing more that we simply aren't measuring.
Exactly. Like, did you have a big meal?
Yeah.
Did you drink a lot of water? Did you think about your ex-girlfriend?
Yeah.
While you were lying there.
All these things.
What do you say, Marco? Does this surprise you? I guess not. I've read a lot of what you've written, so I know it doesn't surprise you.
Indeed. So I think part of it is linked to what Dan said. So, it's just so many things that could impact the data, especially when we look at it sometimes maybe sporadically, right, before or after, a specific stressor, or in relation to, a questionnaire of, how we feel subjectively, like single data point sort of situation. Then I think it's a bit different also, because it depends, at the population level, what kind of values we have, how do these levels relate to different stressors and things like that, which might be a bit different from the variation within the individual that we look at. Other reasons, I think, are actually the reasons why looking at the data is interesting for the individual, which is that what we look at is not the stressor, is the response to stress, right? So we apply a stressor that could be exercise, but it could be a psychological stressor, it could be any sort of stressor, and then people respond in different ways. And that variability is also linked, for example, to a person's fitness, right? After normalization after a stressor, it could be quicker. I could think that in the context of other stressors and psychological stressors, maybe people that are more used to certain types of stressors, I could think about, there's a lot of research on, public speaking, these kind of things to trigger, strong psychological stressor. I could think also that people that do that may rebound quicker, or maybe even have less of a change acutely as they do it. So the individual variability, I think, is also associated to the fact that if we measure it right, we measure the response, and the response is not obvious. So the athletes, for example, that train, like elite athletes train really hard, but then their physiology is the most stable, right? So it's not that you're not applying very strong stressors, it's that just it bounces back really quickly. So if you look at their response, typically it's very stable, and hardly ever you have suppression in HRV, highlighting, a poor response. But again, people typically associate HRV just with the stressors. So, even when they see a suppression, they say, oh, okay, I did a great session yesterday, it was hard and blah, blah. But that is actually typically a sign that there was a mismatch between the stressor and your ability to cope with the stressor. Otherwise, you would not have that suppression, so to speak. So I think part of the mismatch also between how we feel subjectively and the objective stressors and the physiological measurement is that these three things don't necessarily go together all the time, right? Obviously, there are situations in which typically they are associated. I think also the time frame matters, right? So are we looking at things, in a few minutes? Are we looking at things over a few months? Like, we can do all sorts of things to look at, our physiology and the stressors that we face. And I think typically there are relationships if we do things well, but it doesn't always has to be like that or so simple. And sometimes we also learn from that individual variability and those differences. Yeah, does that make sense?
Absolutely, I think, and if I was trying, I went off on a tangent, so I apologize. But I think if we're trying to pull us back, it sort of comes back to this fact that when we use it to gauge our sleep, we need to understand what the metrics are and how we can use them. And the same actually then is what we're discussing when it comes to the stress response and understanding our own stress. Is how do we actually rely on this metric, and how do we understand this metric, and how do we apply this metric? And I think one of the things I know that people listening to this will probably, a question they might have in their mind is, okay, so we have these two core parameters that most people use this for, which is stress restitution and sleep. That's probably what people ask me the most about the value of wearables. So what is if we should sort of boil it back down to what should people do then with these metrics? What are give me your takes on what you think they can use it for, and how to use it then, if we challenge all these nuances and pitfalls that is in. I think you've already been onto it, but I would like to reiterate for the listener.
Just to be a bit more positive than I have been, it may be motivating to monitor some of these things. Maybe you will change behavior because you are now monitoring. Say you drink less, you try to go to bed earlier, you try to work out more, and
eat
so on.
Healthier.
Yeah, for instance. Then I think that's a very good outcome. But if you're trying to do or make decisions based on, say, for instance, your sleep score or your stress score, I would be careful about that.
Whether or not you should go and meet your friends shouldn't be reliant on the stress score or sleep score. We all can agree.
Yes.
On that, yeah. Okay.
I think there's a lot of obsession with figures and numbers. One of the most common emails that I get is somebody will tell me this is my this is my battery score.
Yeah.
This is my metric that I've never heard of. Yeah. Is this good?
Yeah.
Is this bad? And what do I do? Very, very common question.
Yeah.
Where there could be value in this is looking at overall trends. If you want to change a specific behavior, perhaps you want to drink less, move a little bit more, and you're collecting these data points in fairly regular conditions from time to time, and looking at these overall trends, perhaps this could be of interest. This is what's happening for my physiology in general, but looking at it at a more micro scale, where you're looking at it from day to day and making decisions. I shouldn't see my friends, or that is I'm a little bit more skeptical about that. But in terms of looking at overall trends, it could be of value there, I think.
Do you want to add anything, Marco, or are you aligned with Fredrik and Dan?
Yeah, no, for sure. Same page. I would say, there's more and more metrics every day, right? I think the new subscription business model motivates them to build more and more metrics every day. So my recommendation is always, try to look at what is actually measured. If you need to focus on something, start there, right? And then, you can be curious about the other things and have a look in relation to different things you do. But I would say first, look at what has more solid evidence, and that would be measurements of your resting physiology and how that changes over time. You don't have to start implementing changes, and just observe for a while, right? See if you can learn something just from being more aware about how things are changing based on your behavior. And then maybe you can make some small adjustments. And I think that way the data can be helpful.
I think one of the things, thank you guys, I am totally aligned with what you're thinking. And I think that one of the things, I want to go into two more things before we end this session. One is the body battery, which is immensely popular here in Norway. And I think that's a Garmin feature mainly. So we'll go into that. But one thing that is very near and dear to me is the measurement of inflammatory responses in the body. And one of the things that I've been wrapping my head around is that there are a bunch of claims out there in the public in Norway saying that you can use wearables to actually gauge your inflammation levels and think about what kind of food you are more or less allergic to. And that's, I have to admit, coming from a person who's done very complex panels on inflammatory proteins and reactions and cytokines and everything, I simply cannot understand how that works. Could you enlighten me? Do you guys know about these claims, and do you have an opinion about it?
I would just add something based on what Dan said before that I think really makes this simple, which is these metrics are very sensitive, meaning they pick up anything, but they're not specific of anything. So is a change in HRV associated with a change in inflammation? Possibly. Can you see it in the wearable and be sure that that is the case? Absolutely not. So I think, very sensitive, not specific. It could be anything else. And for food, I think then we link it to body battery and measuring all the time continuously.
Exactly.
And
energy.
Again, Dan mentioned already about water intake, but when you eat something, you have to digest it. Your body is busy doing that, and your heart rate is elevated, and it is perfectly normal. And I think we risk really to basically make any normal physiological response something pathological because we are checking, oh my God, has my physiology changed? And then let's just not do anything all day and lie on the couch and keep our physiology at absolute rest and see how that works out.
Maybe do an ice bath.
Yeah. That's another episode. I think what I'm very skeptical about is the ability to link it to a specific food. So perhaps you're eating something which is increasing inflammation, and that inflammation is linked with HRV. That, plausible. But the ability to link it to a specific food, that I'm very skeptical about. That is, I think, extremely difficult to do.
Yeah. You want to add something?
Nothing to add.
No. Does that mean you agree or disagree?
No, it means that I have absolutely no idea how
it is linked.
How your watch can tell you that.
Yeah, no, I think it goes back to the fact that when you digest something, you will have a reduction in HRV.
On the short term,
the short
the short term, but there's possibly long-term effects as well if there's a food that
is particularly hard for your body to process.
Sure,
more or less.
Sure, that's quite plausible.
That's maybe one of the reasons why, if you are going to measure the HRV, then measuring in the morning, since if you eat something very late, then it will probably make your HRV lower because of the start of the night, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's also a part of mine being sort of the main skeptic in Norway about these measurements is I have to add that I'm actually quite positive in more general terms, in terms of also this consuming of alcohol. Like, it's very obvious to me that you can see that in a wearable because that's a hammer to your physiology.
It's a toxin.
Yeah,
it's a toxin.
So it's no surprise to me. What's maybe more surprising to me is that people do not know that you sleep poorly when you have had a lot of alcohol. So that's and if the wearable can teach you that, that's awesome. Yeah, that's a good thing. But okay, so we're winding down, but one like sort of pillar is left standing, and that's the metric of energy. The fact that your body is a battery and you can charge it, not by using 220 volts, but by using your wearable.
I actually had a body battery of 5 on Sunday.
No way. And you're still here.
Yeah, I survived. I was on 5 for many hours.
Okay.
It didn't drop anymore, but...
So first off, do anyone want to explain how you understand? So the nuts and bolts are proprietary. So I've asked Garmin for how they calculate this.
Okay.
But it's more in general terms. They've told me stress and sleep, basically. So what is your understanding of what this is and how it works in the metric?
They told you based on stress and sleep.
No. That's basically what their app says.
Okay. But then again, as we already touched on, stress and sleep are estimates of something else again.
So it's layers upon layers. But it's tied to the fact that I think the initial, if I read the literature correctly, the initial thing is that energy consumption is basically heat dissolution from the body in a way, and they sort of extract this idea from the law of thermodynamics, like the conservation of energy and the release of energy and the consumption of energy in changing shapes and forms. But I don't know if that's the algorithm. But what do you guys think? What about this metric?
I mean, I'm curious to how they validated it, what measures they're using. But I guess if it's a proprietary measure, then
what's your reference?
I have to say from the clinic, it makes absolutely no sense to me in terms of thinking of the body as a battery. But Marco, sorry.
Yeah, I think there's the beauty of made-up metrics, right? There is no reference for any of this. So readiness, recovery, body battery is like, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And then, people that buy a typical example is, but I was sick and I could see my body battery. And that is like an enormous stressor, right? I mean, obviously it can be picked up by any measurement you can make, but that doesn't mean that, the way that it is used on a daily basis is meaningful. To me, so body battery was maybe one of the first of these sort of stress scores, right? It's a bit different from what the others are offering now because there is this concept of the battery, while the others maybe provide this sort of stress level in real time. But I think many of the pitfalls are the same, right? Coming back to the issue of not measuring in a well-defined context, and again, things as simple as drinking water, right? So you trigger a change in your blood volume and then your HRV is higher. And, when I pointed this out once and then they told me, because you're better hydrated. So, that is good for you and your HRV is better. So no, that is not it. It is not working that way.
Yeah.
I wonder how this is falsifiable. Like, how do you actually falsify this concept of a body battery? I think for me, that's a really good test of how useful this could be. And it's one of those things that you can almost find a justification no matter which way, that you have a high value or low value. Oh, this fits with how I'm feeling. So it's a very difficult concept.
Yeah, but if you start actually noting down the first thing in the morning, what are you feeling? And then you look at this
Body
objective measurement, then you will see it's not always the same, right? So, for instance, recently I was feeling really shit, but I had a sleep score of almost 100 and my body battery was at 100. So it didn't capture what I was feeling. So I think and that's another point, if you are going to measure any of this, I think you should write down your subjective feeling first. And then
it's a really good suggestion.
Yeah, it's a good suggestion. And I think that's part of what, so I can sort of beat around the bush and ask you guys, but I can also take the direct sort of target hit myself because my background is stress physiology and stress research. And what has become obvious to me is that there is this feedback loop going between these metrics and the way people are feeling. And one of the issues is that in terms of having this uncertainty level in these metrics is that they actually coach you in a negative way, meaning that your trust in your own intrinsic or internal subjective feeling lessens when you have this metric telling you, because people are very keen on numbers. We like numbers and we get affected by numbers. So if I tell you that my car is worth $100 million and I'm offering to sell it to you for $1, you will probably buy it. But if it's bullshit, the car is just impounded the next day, it's not $1 that's well spent. So it anchors us, is my point, in some shape or form. And I think that's hugely problematic when you know that these filtering in the brain of how your subjective feeling is not a reaction to your body. It's actually a prediction of what your body is going to experience. So your brain is actually moving a little bit faster than your actual physiology. So it's trying to predict the next move. So what you're actually doing is you're giving yourself a crappy day when you're checking this metric and learning from it and saying, oh, my body battery is low, I have to be careful today. You're actually giving yourself a bad day. You're not learning from the past. You're actually giving yourself a bad day in the future.
And even if you know this,
I
feel you will be affected by the information.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I once did one of those continuous glucose measurements where I put this needle in my arm. Have you guys tried that? No? It was my metric was going off the charts. Because I also like metrics, that's my point. But the fact that this needle was in my arm, and I could see, when I injected it, I looked at it first, and it sort of stuck to my brain. Like this needle is there. And they told me that it was not painful. But I was like, it's distinctly painful. I'm very keenly aware. That goes to what you're saying, Fredrik, is that even though it's probably not an issue at all for my physiology, the fact that it lodged into my brain, and I know that it shouldn't be this painful, but it is painful. It's still there. It's just still there. Guys, our time is up. I want to end by thanking you so much for sharing your knowledge, your immense expertise, and your kind perspectives on this. I think that we could do probably a series of 10 podcasts on this topic.
For sure.
But I think we highlighted some of the important aspects of this, and I hope you had a good time, and thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Og til deg som hører på, så kan vi ta og ses om en uke eller to. Da vil vi få flere spennende episoder fra oss. Tusen takk.